So we're going to get started. We do have 4 chairs up here for anyone who's old or infirm. Those of you who are young and able-bodied can stand for a while. We'll be quick. But there are 4 chairs right here in the front if anybody needs a chair. Nobody's moving towards them. Okay, so one person can lie down on those 4 chairs. Okay, there he is. Good man, good man. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, gender nonconforming and trans deities, let's give it up for a very special evening with Dr. Rashid Khalidi. I promise we won't do drawn out intros and welcoming, but it's really important, I think, to acknowledge all the invisible labor that goes into making something like this. So right off the bat, I want to thank our volunteers, thank Pilsen Community Books, thank Mia and Charles from the Hoodoisie and Latinxs from Under the Tree podcast, as well as the artists that donated their prints and posters, Fabiana Rodriguez, Aaron Hughes, Gray Rosa, as well as my husband who's working merch back there. Shout out to our host, Co-Prosperity Sphere, as well as Amal Music Group. And to Haneen Shriyam, co-founder of Latinos for Palestine, as well as Luis Mora. They've curated and made specialty cocktails for tonight for all of you all to enjoy.
Over here, Pilsen Community Books has started a pop-up bookstore, and Rashid's books are available, many other books, and Rashid and I will both be here after the event to sign books, so please get books. It's very important that we support an institution like Pilsen Community Books. Yes. So let's hear it for Pilsen Community Books. The pop-up store in the back, as Ricardo mentioned, has posters, it has T-shirts, it has scarves, it has all kinds of merchandise. Everything that we raise tonight is going to Palestine Legal. Palestine Legal, works to support and defend those who are fighting for freedom for Palestine and self-determination for Palestine. And the brilliant founder is, I would point her out, except I can't see her. Dima Khalidi is here. And if you don't want merch, but you want to donate to Pal Legal, there's a QR code on 2 posters up here in the front. So we're asking for donations for posters, $10 suggested. We're asking for donations for scarves, $25. We're asking for donations for totes and T-shirts. But please go in the back and help us raise money for Pal Legal. Back to you.
Yeah, so I think we could just get started, right?
Let's get started. Introduce this man.
This man needs no introduction, but this is Dr. Rashid Khalidi, the author of 100 Years War on Palestine. Let's give it up. He's authored several books, co-edited 3 journals. He's a professor, the Edward Said Professor at Columbia University, and is also here in Chicago. I just want to give a special thank you for Dr. Khalidi for being here because he's here visiting family. I can only imagine how intimate and how hard this moment must be for him as well, but offered up his time and agreed to come out and talk to all of us. So let's give it up. And you all know Bill Ayers, activist icon. Here with Under the Tree podcast, you all should go listen. I am Ricardo Gamboa. I am just a very loud homosexual from the south side of Chicago. Just very lucky and happy, and hopefully here fostering solidarity between Chicago's Latino and Palestinian American community, 2 of the largest minority populations here in the city. And all the other solidarities and connections that we can make. Yeah. So let's get started. And Ricardo, you have the first comment question. Well, so I think one of the things is just building off the book right away is I think part of how colonialism often works is abstracting the timeline of the violence that it's enacting. And so one of the things that we really saw with this moment was pinning it as starting October 7th. And even when people began to educate themselves and getting more critical, they pinned it to something like the Nakba, the Zionist invasion of Palestine and the establishment of Israel. However, one of the things your book does is explode that timeline open right away. It says that this is a settler colonial project that has its roots in late 19th century Zionism, as well as with settler colonialism that even began then under mandatory Palestine, when Britain nurtured Jewish immigration, as well as the establishment of a para-state is how you refer to it. So thinking about all of that, I guess one of the questions that we wanted to start off with was thinking, are we at a moment when Zionism has been exposed? So often we kind of hear that Zionism is just this notion of Jewish people looking for a safe place to live. But is Zionism also inherently a settler colonial ideology? How are you classifying its historical kind of like this historical moment with regard to Zionism right now?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you everybody for being here. I really appreciate so many people coming out. It's a great source of solace to those of us who are feeling with what's happening there, to realize that there are so many people who are feeling with us in this very horrible, difficult moment. I mean, it really makes me feel a sense of solidarity that everybody recognizes that what is happening is something that affects us all. And to go back to your question, it starts not on October 7th. In fact, it doesn't even start when my book starts in 1917, or even when you suggested with the beginning of Zionism or the penetration by European imperialism into the Middle East. It starts in 1492. It starts with European colonialism. And what we're talking about when we talk about colonialism is the same product. Europe going overseas, enslaving people, seizing people's resources, taking over places for strategic reasons, and in many cases, exporting European populations, white European populations, to take the place of brown and black populations. That's settler colonialism. The rest is just, common garden variety colonialism. And what we see in Palestine is a little bit of both. It's a settler colonial project in terms of Zionism, but it was just an imperial project as far as Britain was concerned. They wanted this piece of real estate for strategic reasons. They didn't give a goddamn about Jewish suffering. The foreign secretary who issues the Balfour Declaration in 1917, Lord Balfour, is the author of one of the most anti-Semitic pieces of legislation in British history, the Alien Exclusion Act, to keep Jewish refugees out of England in 1905. He comes back in 1917 and issues the Balfour Declaration. So this is not an act of concern for the suffering of Jewish people. This is British imperialism doing something for its own interests and allying itself with this settler colonial project, which is its own independent thing, growing out of the persecution of Jews in Europe, yes, but allying itself with imperialism from the beginning to this day, and seeing itself as a movement that will replace the population of Palestine. In the words of an early Zionist leader, we were going to transform Palestine into the land of Israel. That's what it was always about. Yes, it was about rescuing populations. Yes, it was about a Jewish national project. But yes, it was also always linked to imperialism, then and now. And yes, it always had this replacement. I mean, we are living in a country, in a place, which is witness to a project of replacement of an indigenous native population with a white European settler population. So this shouldn't be so hard for us to understand, that the same kind of thing has been happening, is today happening in the occupied West Bank as we speak, is happening not just in Gaza, is happening in occupied Arab East Jerusalem as we speak. So this is an ongoing process. And I think that a lot of you are here because, to use the expression that Tom just said, you're believing what you see with your eyes. You don't believe the lying statements that are coming out of the White House. You don't believe the lying statements that are coming out of CNN. You don't believe the words dripping with hypocrisy that come from the mouths of people like Kirby and Blinken. You see what is happening. This is a massacre. This is a genocide. This is a process intended to make people suffer, starve them, push them out of their homes, burn their homes after you push them out of their homes. And you're seeing these things in social media, in alternative media. And you're smarter, in fact, than the generation of older people who unfortunately are hooked on mainstream corporate media. And that's why I'm sure a lot of you are here, because you know what's going on. Even if you don't know the details, you can see. You know the evidence of your eyes, what you have seen. So,
What's unique about the Zionist colonial project as opposed to, say, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United States? What makes it unique? And it feels to me like we're in some kind of inflection point. How do you name this political moment?
What's different? I mean, there's a lot of things that are different about it, actually. It's unique in many respects. It is backed by an imperial sponsor. They all are. It involves a replacement by originally an almost entirely European population. Now the population of Israel obviously includes a lot of people who are not from Western Europe or Eastern Europe. And in those respects, it's similar. It's different in that usually settler colonialism involves two things: an extension of the sovereignty of the mother country. So England sends English and Scots settlers, planters they call them, to take over the land of indigenous Irish people, kick them out, and replace them with English people, English Protestants or Scottish Protestants. That's the standard population transfer that you get in settler colonialism. And it's an extension of the sovereignty of the imperial power. England's power is extended over Ireland. Ireland becomes part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The French do the same thing in Algeria. Mm-hmm. England does the same thing in North America and Canada. Zionism is different in a couple of respects. Yes, you have the imperial backing, and yes, it's a settler colonial project, but it is also a national project. It also is an independent project which is not seeing itself and is not an extension of the sovereignty of the mother country. It's not an English settlement in Palestine. It's a Jewish settlement in Palestine. It's connected to imperialism. It can't survive without imperialism, but it's a transactional relationship. When French settlers go to Algeria, or English settlers come to Massachusetts, or Virginia, or Maryland, they come as English people. They come as an extension of the population and the sovereignty of the mother country. That's not the case with Zionism. So it's different in that way, and in fact, in other ways.
Is Zionism, I mean, this moment feels to me that Zionism's mask has been ripped off as a democratic, Jew. It feels to me like Zionism is up for re-examination, and because of that, U.S. imperialism people are being awakened to the reality of U.S. imperialism as an enabler, as an ally of genocide.
No, I think I didn't actually answer Ricardo's question, and you've just sort of repeated it. And I should answer it. I actually think that this is a turning point of sorts. This is a moment when masks are falling, and not just off of the Zionist project, but also over the support that the United States is giving to this. Why are we sending 120 millimeter tank shells such that the Israeli army can bombard Palestinian civilians? Why are we sending 155 millimeter? We're sending them free for them to use to kill Palestinians. Why? I mean, you have to go back to some kind of understanding of imperialism, some kind of understanding of strategic interests which have absolutely no connection to the lying rhetoric. Rules-based international order? What rules? What order? This is savagery. And it's naked before your eyes if you simply see it on Al Jazeera, or you see it on social media, or you see it on alternative media. And so in that sense, yes, I think that the mask is being ripped from the face of Zionism. Rescue Project, it was in part. National Project, it is to some extent. But it is also a process, just like every other settler colonial process, where you are dispossessing people, moving them like they're animals out of their homes and destroying their homes. And in the case of Gaza, they're now projecting we're going to establish new settlements in Gaza. And they are doing that all over the West Bank as I speak.
Yeah.
No, because it's like my mind is just like going right now, and I think one of the things I think about is like there's like the particularity of the Zionist project, but then there's also like its resonances with colonialism and settler colonialism, particularly in the Americas, right? And there's very glaring. So it says Latinos for Palestine. If you think about Spanish colonialism, part of what it did was mobilize tropes, right? So the native in the Americas, in the hemisphere, in the Central and South Americas, was an Indio Bárbaro. right? That they were barbaric, and that and that actually colonialism was going to improve their status and refine their humanity so that they can actually be an equal kind of modern subject. And we see that, in the first literatures of, in the writing of around Zionism. Right. But also the way that trope has been refined throughout time to actually become, right, the Muslim terrorist, and it's kind of been transpositioned, like that type of like stereotypical figure. So even when we think about 9/11, there's kind of like this it's a transit, right, where we see that post 9/11, that kind of fear that was manufactured around the discursive figure of the Muslim terrorist transposed onto undocumented immigration, so that within a decade we can have a president leverage anti-immigrant rhetoric to get himself into office. And I think Chicago is so much where we see so many of glaring rhetorics of colonialism still kind of alive, and its segregation, and the fact that we have the largest prison, and the sort of things that are so resonant with what's happening in Gaza.
I mean, I'm glad you brought up this issue of dehumanization, because it's another characteristic of settler colonialism. I mean, you see it all across the Americas, from the very beginning of Spanish and Portuguese and English and French colonialism here. The treatment of the indigenous population as if they're subhuman, as if they're less than human. Only we, Europeans, are human, fully human. And you get that rhetoric today. The Israeli Minister of Defense said we're fighting human animals the first week of the war. You go back to Herzl. We will be a barrier for Europe against the barbarism of Asia. It's the same rhetoric. It's the same mentality. We, Europeans, are superior. Now, you can talk about the degree to which Herzl reflected the persecution of Jews in Europe, and at the same time was European in the way in which he looked at the native population of Palestine. So you can be two things at once. Zionism is several things at once. But this is a trope that you will find in every colonial movement. This is a trope you'll find especially in a settler colonial movement. You have to justify taking people's land away. You have to justify putting them in pens, putting them in reservations, enslaving them. And dehumanization is.
But mirroring that dehumanization is the dehumanization of the oppressor, and this is something James Baldwin was so brilliant about. And I think we're already seeing it. We've been seeing it, but I think that even on CNN a few nights ago, there were pictures of, Israeli forces dancing and celebrating, and they were posing in front of a university that had been bombed out, and one of them was laughing and saying, well, we've made an open university. And so it's the dehumanization of the colonizers themselves is a part of it too.
I mean, you're right. Both Baldwin and Fanon saw both sides of this. They saw the way in which colonialism dehumanized the colonized, but they also saw the awful things that it does to the colonizer. I mean, what does this do to policemen when they're beating up people in Ferguson? I'm not sympathizing with them. I'm saying the same kind of process that is happening in a Ferguson, or was happening in South Africa as they beat up people, or was happening in Algeria where they shot down people during the Algerian Revolution, is happening in Israel. Yeah. To Israeli soldiers. You're absolutely right. Yeah. There's a dehumanization that's necessary for colonialization or colonialism, but there's also a dehumanization that's necessary to make people do these things to other people.
In Nathan Thrall's extraordinary book, A Day of the Life of Abed Salama, you remember in the epilogue, he talks about Israeli kids, middle schoolers, celebrating the death of 5-year-olds, and not anonymously, going on social media and naming themselves and saying, 5-year-olds are dead, great, no more, another generation of terrorists eliminated. I mean, that is really disgusting.
Yeah, I'm thinking, because, you brought up terrorism, violence, right? And then you brought up Fanon. So, I studied colonialism. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, but I always if I'm a scholar, I'm a Fanonian scholar, right? And so we're talking about Wretched of the Earth as masterwork. And in the first chapter on violence, right, he talks about colonialism is not a thinking machine. It is not something that is embodied with reason. In its essence, and its naked nature, it is violence, and it only responds and yields when confronted with violence. And so I'm asking that because that is very clearly, right, an underpinning around this, and one of the things that was quickly used to kind of try and delegitimize Palestinian liberation, right? It was like October 7th, this aggression that occurred. And then also, right, thinking about terrorists, and since Bill, you've been called a terrorist a few times in your life, I think if like both of you all kind of can even like speak to violence and violence
I'm gonna let you answer that one, Bill.
these notions of violence and terrorism at play right now, and kind of how those rhetorics are being used, and how to see beyond them, and what new stories we can write, around violence that are not just confined to this kind of like liberal notion of repressing it and marking and villainizing it.
I mean, any scholar of colonialism will say colonial violence necessarily produces resistance. Yep. Even Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of the revisionist strain of Zionism, out of which the Likud party, Netanyahu, Ariel Sharon, Shamir, Begin come, he said it himself. He said any colonial project will produce resistance from the native population. They will fight us, and we have to overwhelm them. I mean, he was very clear about it. He was one of the few honest ones. Most of the time they were giving it a snow job. No, this can be done without harming the native. In fact, we'll help you. It'll be good for you to be colonized. Mm-hmm. Begin was, Jabotinsky was more blunt and more honest about that. And that's true always and everywhere. And Fanon is one of the best exponents, and he's the best explainer of this. Black Faces, White Masks, a number of his books and a number of his writings, as is Baldwin. Mm-hmm. The kind of violence that colonialism, that is necessary for colonialism, always produces resistance, and that resistance is always coded either as, in the case of Ireland, it's banditry. That's what the English use. They're bandits, or in India, they're bandits. They weren't bandits. Mm-hmm. They were resisting the dispossession of their people, or the subjugation of their people.
My favorite was the accent you just did when you performed.
Well, if my son were, so my son's coming, he could do a much better English accent than I can. He'll be here, and I'll ask him to.
But it's an important point, Ricardo. I think that violence is inherent in certain situations. Slavery is violent at its core. It's not a choice, and people could live for generations without actually smacking each other in the nose, but it's still violence, and it's held up by violence. As soon as Nat Turner rises up, he's somehow a crazy person or a violent person, and that's the same thing we're witnessing here. The other thing that goes along with that is, you talked about the lying mythology and the lying ideology. Every time someone wants to point out that this is a genocide, that this is not proportional response, always the media tends to go back to October 7th. Like October 7th is the only thing that happened. Comment on that.
Yeah. On October 7th and immediately afterwards, approximately 1,100, almost 1,200 people were killed, of whom 800 were civilians. It's the largest civilian death toll in Israeli history since 1948. Israel has killed, including the 7,000 or 8,000 people who are missing under the rubble, about 38,000 Palestinians. So there was a ghastly death toll on the 7th and the 8th. About 400 of those people were military and police, and about 800 of them were civilians. The Palestinian death toll, about 80% of which is civilians, is 38,000 and counting, about 100 a day. And it's going on until it's stopped by this country. Nobody else will stop it, and if this country doesn't stop it, it will not stop. It will continue. And even if they stop it temporarily, it'll continue after that. Read what the Israeli government says it's going to do. It's very clear that's what this government intends to do, and our government will fund it, our government will arm it, our government will protect it in the Security Council. So what happened on October 7th was actually the largest civilian death toll in Israeli history since 1948, but this is the largest depopulation of Palestinians, dispossession of Palestinians, including 1948. Over almost 2 million people have been forced from their homes, and most of their homes have been destroyed or damaged. In 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were dispossessed and kicked out and never returned to their homes. This is the largest death toll. This is the largest dispossession in Palestinian history, in the entirety of modern Palestinian history. And that scale should be in everybody's mind. Not that the 7th of October wasn't a horrible toll of civilians, but that if these are innocent civilians, these are innocent civilians. And we're talking about a 25-to-1 ratio. We're talking about 4.5% of the population of Gaza have been killed or wounded or are missing. 4.5%, and that percentage is going up every single day.
Well, it's weird because we're talking about mask off, like the mask of U.S. imperialism is off, the mask of Zionism is off. But I also think what's also come off is the mask of terrorism as a discourse that enables imperialism, that enables kind of violence, right? And we've seen the way that's been able to be used, not even just in the Middle East, but also here, right? The Cop City activists have been labeled as terrorists. Black Lives Matter activists have been labeled as terrorists. And I say that because so much of this isn't just about how do we take rhetorics, how do we just kind of consume Palestinian experience and knowledge and oppression, but also how we use it in our own daily lives after a night like this to kind of contest things. And so I think so often that notion of do you condemn Hamas, but what about terrorism, has been used to legitimize the violence that's happening right now. And whenever we do that, we're not just legitimizing the violence against them, we're legitimizing the repression of our activism here. And so it's so important to refute that at every turn, because for me, how I'm understanding it at this point is terrorism is violence without a state, because it's not terrorism when Israel is enacting that scale of violence. It's not terrorism when the U.S. has been enacting it, right? So it seems to be that the actual differential is a state, right?
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Ricardo. Terrorism is non-state violence, a term used by states that use the same kind of violence on a much greater scale against civilians. But they are never allowed to be called terrorists. When the United States bombs Vietnam, that's not terrorism. But attacks by Vietnamese freedom fighters on American troops are terrorism. When Israel kills 38,000 people, 80% of whom are civilians, that's not terrorism.
Yeah, and so I even think like right now, and I don't know how, like one of the things I've been struggling with myself is that, you know, again, like mask off on rhetorics of terrorism, mask off on Zionism, mask off on imperialism. But for me, I'm feeling like mask off on democracy, because I don't really feel we live in one anymore. You know, and I kind of haven't in a while. But like when we see all these protests, when we see all this clamoring for a ceasefire or for land back, and yet the government is completely unresponsive, right? It's hard to actually carry on this fantasy of democracy. And I almost think, you know, good, mask off. Now let's fuck it up, right?
You know, you described October 7th though as you know, despicable and horrible, and so you're
in terms of the attacks on civilians.
That's
yes.
what I'm saying. And so, in a sense, you're asking us to think about international standards and universal standards. Maybe you could speak to that for a moment.
Right. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. Some of this is legal stuff. I'm a historian. You know, I mean, people ask me, what's going to happen? A job description of historian doesn't include predicting the future. Job description of a historian doesn't include, you know, analyzing legal terms like in international humanitarian law. But if attacks on civilians are violations of international humanitarian law, then all attacks on civilians are violations of international humanitarian law. I mean, if a hospital in Tel Aviv were hit by a rocket because there are Israeli soldiers being treated there, would that be considered justification? Of course not. Every hospital in Gaza has been attacked. Every single health facility in Gaza has been attacked with the pretext that, oh, they're using these civilians as human shields. I mean, are the nurses and doctors in the hospitals across Israel human shields? Of course not. It's absurd. The fact that they can get away with this nonsense is a function of the corruption of our system, obviously, and our lack of not only of democracy, but of any kind of honesty in the media. I have done dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews with the media since October 7th, maybe hundreds. Almost every young journalist I talk to tells me what kind of pressure they are under from their editors, their producers, the executives, the bosses, the owners, every single one of them, the young ones especially. The degree to which things are masked, things are hidden through the mass media is absolutely extraordinary. I can give you chapter and verse, paper after paper, The New Yorker, The New York Post, The New York Times, MSNBC, CNN, every one of them that I've had an interaction with. Some young producer will tell me, some young journalist will tell me, well, we can't do that. Why can't you do that? We can't say that. Why can't you say that? Well, because. And then they point to their producers, their editors, the people who own the damn newspapers or own the damn corporate mass media.
Well, I mean, it's having me think, because in the fourth chapter of your book is 1982. It's the Israeli aggression on Lebanon. You were living in Beirut at the time. It's actually wild because, like, I was like screaming at my book like you scream at a television, like, Rashid, get out of there! And it's during but it's like during these bombings. And I think one of the things that was so wild was seeing the kind of congruences between that moment and this moment, down to kind of even like you had like the New York Times. You mentioned this incident with the reporter Thomas Friedman, who wrote indiscriminate bombings, and they had changed the headline and edited it.
They took the word out.
Yeah.
They took the word out. He wrote indiscriminate bombardment, and in fact, later on, this was published in a magazine that no longer exists, the Village Voice. He leaked the interchange between him and A.M. Rosenthal, who was then the foreign editor of the Times. He was in West Beirut. They were indiscriminately bombing West Beirut, as they have always indiscriminately bombed everywhere, because they learned everything they knew from British counterinsurgency experts, whose methodology was to terrorize the colonized population. They taught them that, and they have done that ever since they had an army. In fact, before they had an army, when it was just the Haganah and the Palmach, they were taught that. The name of the guy who did it was Wingate, a captain. He picked it up from Sudan and Ireland and India, and he did it in Palestine, and he taught them. And that's what they have done, indiscriminate bombardment. So when Tom Friedman, bureau chief of the New York Times in Beirut in 1982, is having his hotel, he's in the Commodore Hotel in West Beirut, being bombed, and there's nothing, no target, no military target for miles or kilometers. And he puts it in his piece, indiscriminate Israeli bombardment of West Beirut. A.M. Rosenthal takes it out. And he argues with him in an internal Times. They had some kind of Slack thing at that time. In the 80s, God knows what they had. I don't know what they had. Some telex thing. You know what a telex is?
We had pagers on the south side.
Yeah, whatever. And Rosenthal takes the word out. And so he leaks it to the Village Voice. It's been published. Alexander Coburn actually picked it up in the Village Voice. Yeah, so we couldn't get out.
Yeah.
In 82, there was nowhere to go.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you mentioned taking refuge in American University.
Right.
But it has me thinking, right, just because I feel, what's very proven in this moment is that, like, colonialism and wars are not necessarily fought through just brute violence. They're fought through discourse. One of the reasons why we see in this genocide, I'm thinking about Ramon Grosfoguel, Latin American decolonial scholar, and he says, like, everywhere that the Spanish and went, they didn't just kill the bodies, they burnt the temples and they burnt the libraries. And what he's talking is not just about genocide, but about epistemicide, how you eliminate alternative ways of knowing and cosmovisions and things like that. Now, he lists 4 major epistemicides, and the fourth one that he uses is about white women that were referred to as witches in Europe. And one of the things that he says is they were illiterate, so they didn't have books to burn. So what do? They burnt the bodies. And so I think about that with reference to the journalists that we're seeing right now, is that it's an epistemic attack on giving us, since all of them, right, have access to social media, all of them are a book and a testament to the genocide that is happening right now, but also in a moment in which everybody has access to social media. So is every Palestinian child that can get access to an eSIM. So is any, we saw what happened when Hind was able to make a phone call that was able to get access. And so I'm thinking about, like, how I'm thinking about this right now is, like, when we're in the belly of the beast that is funding not just this genocide, but this epistemicide, every mosque, every university, every school where knowledge is also held, what is the discourse and the knowledge we have to carry on? Because I never thought I'd be like some bitch that's looking up Palestinian agricultural methods, but I'm like, someone needs to carry this on, and I, like, you know what I mean? Like, and so I'm just thinking, like, what are, when you, like, I guess the question is twofold. What are the discourses that we can, the discourses that we can push forward and that we can carry on, and also, like, the kind of, like, how do we to ensure survival of some of those ways of knowing?
I mean, one of the best ways is literature. People tell their stories more through literature than through journalism or essays or history or academia. I mean, literature is where poetry, prose, novels. That's where a lot of cultural knowledge resides. And what is going on in Gaza right now is a textbook case of epistemicide. 2 university presidents, 7 university deans, about 50 university faculty, maybe more today. As of the time we had a demonstration at Columbia when I listed those numbers, I don't know how many more have been killed since. Have been killed by the Israelis. Every single university in Gaza has been destroyed. The municipal archive, which goes back 150 years, has been destroyed. This is an epistemicide. The mosque that goes back to the 8th century has been destroyed. One of the oldest churches in Christianity, 5th century church, has been severely damaged. And these are not military targets. This is destroying the cultural heritage of a people. It's part of change. Epistemicide is exactly the right word. And this is not new for the Israelis. They attacked the Palestine Research Center in Beirut 3 times, and they finally destroyed it. First, they attacked it, and then they tried to kill the director, and then they attacked it again, and then they sacked it and took the contents back to Israel with the Israeli army in '82. And that's not the only cultural institution of the sort that has been attacked. In Jerusalem, all over Palestine, this happens and has been happening. It happens to archaeological ruins. I mean, you steal a people's heritage and you change the names and you're destroying cultural heritage, collective knowledge. Brian Friel talks about this in his play Translations, how the British were changing place names, how the British were essentially Anglicizing Ireland. And that's what, it goes back to Jabotinsky, transforming Palestine into the land of Israel. It's not just the name. It's every single marker of cultural belonging that is being attacked. And people. You kill a university president, or you kill a professor, or you kill a poet, or you kill a journalist. You're killing transmitters of knowledge, cultural and other forms of knowledge within a people.
I want to just interject that we are not going to do question and answer, although we've got 10 or 15 more minutes here. But if you have a question, there will be 3x5 cards coming around, and if you'd like to jot down a question, we'll curate them up here and try to get to a few of them. You were involved as an advisor to the Palestine delegation to the Washington and Madrid and Washington negotiations. Later, there was Oslo. Talk a bit about your role or about what came out of those negotiations, and then talk a bit about Oslo, which Edward Said called Palestine's Versailles. Right. And I'd be interested in your comments on all of that. I got it.
Right. When I was in Jerusalem doing research for a book, Faisal Husseini asked me, there are going to be negotiations, and would you be an advisor? And I stupidly said yes. And I didn't believe that there would be negotiations. The Israeli government of the day, headed by Yitzhak Shamir, was dead set against any negotiations and wasn't prepared to allow a Palestinian delegation there at all. But eventually it happened. And I got a call. I was in Chicago. I was living in Chicago at the time on the south side here in Hyde Park. Come to Amman, we're leaving from Madrid tomorrow or the day after. Anyway, what did I learn? What I learned was that neither Israel nor the United States had any intention, under any circumstances, of allowing a sovereign, independent, contiguous, sustainable Palestinian state to come into emergence. There was no possibility under the negotiating framework and the ground rules that the United States and Israel imposed on the Palestinians for that to happen. So these were not peace negotiations. These were, as Edward put them, surrender negotiations. We figured that out. It took us only a few sessions before we realized this is the ceiling. See this table? That's the ceiling. You can go this high and no higher. That's it. That's it. No independence. Israeli occupation will continue. Israeli security control will continue. Israeli control of resources will continue. Israeli settlement and colonization will continue. But you can have self-government. And that's really all that was ever intended. I had left the negotiations. We stopped in June of 1993 because we realized we couldn't get what we thought might be a possibility, which is Palestinian independence, sovereignty, and so on, in a fraction of our homeland, a fraction, 20-odd% of our homeland. But even that was not going to be allowed. A couple of years later, in his last speech, Yitzhak Rabin, the then prime minister, said before the Knesset, what we are prepared to offer the Palestinians is less than a state. What we are prepared to offer the Palestinians will include our security control. That's been the Israeli bottom line. And that is the American bottom line. The Israelis wrote it, and the Americans endorsed it. So that's what Oslo was about.
But what fascinates me is that in the current moment, I hadn't heard the idea of a two-state solution uttered by anyone until October 7th.
Right.
And suddenly Blinken and Biden pulled it out of a bottom drawer, and now we're talking about a two-state solution.
Right.
As if. But I mean, the two-state solution was dead in the water 20 years ago.
It was dead in the water in the 1990s, in my opinion. And that's why we stopped. I mean, those of us who were involved in those negotiations realized we could not achieve even the most minimal Palestinian national objectives. And that has been apparent to Edward. I wrote an op-ed the day that the damn thing was signed on the White House lawn in the New York Times. I'm shocked that the Times let me write it. In which I said, this is not going to go anywhere. This is not peace. It's not meant to be peace. So when they talk about a two-state solution, what you have to ask them is, do you really mean sovereignty? Do you really mean an end to occupation? Do you really mean rolling back the settlements in which 750,000 illegal Israeli settlers are stealing Palestinian land day in, day out? Of course you don't. That's not what's meant. Sovereignty, independence, statehood, end of occupation, end, removal, out, end of settlement and colonization. Those things are not on the table. So it's meaningless. It's completely meaningless rhetoric.
Yeah, I'm thinking, because you're mentioning being in negotiations, and in the book you mentioned so much about your own activism, the activism of your family from your great uncle writing Theodore Herzl, and then there's a kind of like myriad of ways that Palestinians were resisting. So it's not just kind of a chronicle of Israeli oppression, which is what we hear all the time, but also just kind of like this document that is archiving all these forms of Palestinian resistance. I think one of the things that surprised me was when we talk about the Intifada, right? We have the image of the children throwing rocks, but in your book, it touches on how actually sophisticated those networks of resistance were. And so thinking in this moment right now, like, what is something that you think U.S. resistance needs to learn from Palestinian resistance, or could use in our confrontations with the state, with in our communities, and I'm just
You're hearing the militants clicking their fingers because there are many people here.
I hear 'em.
Many people here shut down the Woodward munitions. And frankly, I'd like you to speak to that, but I'd also like you to speak to the fact that it's taken just a few months for people to wake up in this country to the reality of what's going on, not just in this room, but much more broadly. And I attribute a lot of it to Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine and others. But how do you see this moment? And back to Ricardo's question, what is to be done?
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm going to go back to what I do, which is I'm a historian. And one of the things I've learned is that every successful liberation movement has used a myriad of tools for liberation. One of my favorites, I pay a lot of attention to Algeria and South Africa. One of my favorites is the Irish, who had to do it twice. They had to do it after the turn of the century, in 1916, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. And then the British kept a chunk of Ireland, and they've been doing it in Northern Ireland ever since. And they used every possible means. They used boycott. The Irish invented boycott. It's a brilliant tool. Everybody has used it. Cesar Chavez used it. In South Africa, they used it. The Indians used it. It's a enormously important tool. They used violence. They used parliamentary means. They used a sophisticated understanding of public opinion. The Irish were campaigning here in the United States and in Britain at the same time as they were fighting the British, whether we're talking about the War of Independence from 1918 to 1921, or whether we're talking about the Troubles from 1968 until 1998. They were doing all of those things at once. And each case requires a different set of tools, obviously. The Vietnamese understood this perfectly. At the same time they were fighting the American forces in Southeast Asia, they were understanding that you have to win over public opinion in this country. The Algerians understood the same thing about France. You can't fight the French and the colons in Algeria and just leave it at that. You have to change public opinion in the metropole. And they did. And that's one of the great things about this moment. It's that whatever's happening in Palestine is only part of resistance. Part of it has to be here. And it can't just be Arab Americans or Palestinian Americans or Muslim Americans. It has to be everybody. And it means you have to connect the struggle to everybody else's struggle, whether gay, whether Latinx, whether black, whatever it may be, unions, churches, whoever it may be. There has to be, you have to make people understand that this is not just about Palestine. There are a broader set of issues that Palestine raises. Why are our tax dollars going to kill Palestinians? We're all paying for that. The goddamn roads are full of potholes. We have the worst train systems on earth. The worst public transportation on earth. I haven't been to a country that has worse public transport or worse trains or worse airports than the United States. But we have the money to give Israel billions a year to kill Palestinians, and that's just a fraction of what the military-industrial complex gobbles up of this country's wealth, produced by ordinary working people. It's not the billionaires who produce it, and they're the ones who decide it's going to go to Raytheon, or it's going to go to Lockheed Martin, or it's going to go to whoever else is going to kill people somewhere else on the globe, or to the police, to Cop City.
There's over 5 dozen of them now that have been in Chicago since I think 20, or been in across the country that have been built or being built. And it kind of, to me, like when you think about the kind of JINSA or the ADL, kind of the way they've been kind of fostering those partnerships between U.S. police and
The Israelis.
Yeah.
I've got some questions here.
Go for
And maybe I'll take a couple first. One, what do you see as the difference between South African apartheid and the situation in Palestine?
Yeah.
Should we compare more to Algeria? I mean, how do you see it?
Yeah.
And
That's a great question.
The other piece of that is the land from the river to the sea is about half Arab, right? I got that.
You mean in terms of ownership?
In terms of population.
Oh, yeah.
So the likelihood of the ethnic cleansing we're seeing now is horrendous, but it's not going to be like Australia.
Can I tag something onto that too, really quick? Well, because I think
there's already 4 questions here, but go for it.
Well, because I think the other thing I want to think too is we hear so much about Palestine with respect to settler colonialism and apartheid and the comparison to South Africa, but also I haven't heard as much people talk about Palestine with respect to racial capitalism, and I think that kind of invoked the mention of South Africa. So just kind of seeing how you think about that connection.
Yeah, I mean, South Africans that I've heard talk about this are pretty blunt. They say, when they go to Palestine, they say, this is much worse than anything we ever dealt with. Yeah. So it is a form of not just racial capitalism. It's a form of ethnic hierarchy. It's a form of, because it's not really racial. Right. This is not a racial issue. It's not even a religious issue. It is racial. It's partly racial capital, and it's partly a kind of ethnic hierarchy and systemic ethnic discrimination, and 2 entirely different legal systems, which is one of the characteristics, as I understand it, not being a lawyer, which is in the definition of apartheid. So by, I think, proper legal standards, this is a case of apartheid. Each one of them is different. Right. Algeria was entirely different. There were laws for the indigènes, for the native population, and they had certain limited rights, and a very tiny segment of, there's always a collaborator class. A tiny segment of them were given rights, full rights, and then the colonists, the French settlers, many of whom were impoverished people who were used as the people who were used to brutalize and hold down the indigenous population. They had a different set of rights. In Israel, actually, it's quite similar to Algeria in some respects, and it's quite similar to South Africa. One of the characteristics of settler colonialism is you don't just subjugate a population, and you don't just institute a regime where some people have some rights and other people have much less. You also push the indigenous population into as small as possible an area. Now, that's in cases where you can't destroy the indigenous population. In North America, they tried to destroy and in part succeeded. In Australasia, they tried to destroy and in part succeeded in destroying a very large proportion of the indigenous population. They couldn't do that in Algeria, and they couldn't do that in Palestine. So what they do is they push the population to smaller and smaller parts of their own land.
Well, they succeeded in Australia and in the United States of decimating the population to the extent that it didn't have any serious political purchase.
Exactly.
I mean, it still existed, but it didn't have any ability to push back.
Well, now we're getting pushback. Fortunately, in Canada and in North America generally. We're
true.
getting pushback because people recognize that what Native Americans and First Nations in Canada want is something that all of us should want. Because one of the things you have to fight is not just, when you talk about colonialism, it's not just what has been done to people. It's not just what has been done to land. It's always, demography and land. But it's also mentalities. And what has been done to the colonizer has to be undone. And that's one of the most important things that will have to be done in Palestine. It's not just reversing or changing or adjusting legal regimes or reversing or changing or adjusting things to do with demography and to do with land. It's also changing these mentalities that have been instilled as part of colonialism. That's the hardest, frankly, that's the hardest part.
As I've watched, though, the resistance here, and as I say, led by young people who are not only courageous, but aren't stopping, and they keep going. As I look at it, I also think that the fact that the black movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the fact that I was very taken when Ta-Nehisi Coates went to Palestine, and he said, I've been told this is complicated. And there's nothing complicated about it. If you know what segregation is, this is what it is. And your comment about South Africans reminds me of that, because if you know what apartheid is, this is what it looks like, even worse.
He came back and he said this at a thing we did together at Union Theological, or in the first couple of weeks of the war. He said, I went to Palestine, and he said, this is just what my parents talked to me about. This is Jim Crow. It's not exactly the same, but I recognize this.
He also noted that he took the 100-year war against Palestine with him on the trip, and that's for sale right over there at Pleasant Community Books.
My publisher thanks you.
Another question? Yeah, lots of other questions. But we're not going to stay forever. What is it about Israel and the U.S.? Why is the relationship so solidified and so seemingly impenetrable? I told you the other night that there was this cartoon of Blinken and Biden wringing their hands in the Oval Office, and finally Blinken about the death of the Palestinians and not getting aid. And finally Blinken says, "Well, I've got an idea. Let's veto another UN resolution." And I mean, so why is there no ability to penetrate this relationship?
I mean, two things. There's strategy and there's politics. The empire sees the Middle East as crucial because of its position. I mean, a few brave Yemenis fire a few anti-ship missiles, and they're among the only peoples on earth who are doing what is required in terms of genocide, which is actually doing something to stop it. They're actually trying to stop it. So, a few brave Yemenis, and you really don't want to mess with Yemenis. Let me tell you. The Ottomans tried it, and the Egyptian army tried it, and you don't want to mess with the Yemenis. The Saudis tried it, didn't work very well. A few brave Yemenis fired a few anti-ship missiles, and the whole of world trade has been affected. Why? Because the Middle East is strategically important. That's one of the reasons. It always has been. You go back to 1948. You go back to why Truman did what he did in forcing through the partition resolution in the General Assembly, why the United States was the first country to recognize Israel, why the United States violated an embargo to ship weapons to the new Israeli state. Because the Pentagon and the State Department said, this is important to our strategic interests. This will protect our oil. This will do this to these air routes. This will do that and the other to sea routes. So if you don't think that the empire considers this part of the world important, if you don't think it considers it important, you need to read a little bit of history. Since Alexander the Great, since the Hittites, since the pharaohs, it's been important to every world conqueror, to every empire. And this is a world conquering empire, and it considers it important. So that's the first part. The second part is politics. You have on the other side a well-organized, deeply committed set of people in both the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party, going way back to Woodrow Wilson, not just now, not just, when the rise of AIPAC 20, 30 years ago, going back generations, for whom this is important. It starts, actually, you're going to be surprised when I tell you this, with Christian Zionism. The first ideas come from people like Lord Shaftesbury in the 1840s, who say the return of the Jewish people to Palestine is a Christian duty. And that is embodied to this day in the Republican Party, in its white, southern, old, male constituency, many of whom are evangelicals, and many of whom believe, because of a certain reading of the Bible that's new, it's 100-something years old, that this is a duty, a bounden duty for Christians. So this is a powerful political force in American, and it has always been in America. And then you have other people within the Democratic Party for other reasons. You've always had people for whom Israel is really important. This is a change that took place in the 1930s and 40s. Before the 1930s and 40s, people talk about anti-Zionism. Do you know where anti-Zionism was the most virulent? In European and American Jewish communities. Anti-Zionism originally was a mainstream political trend among European and American. It was the rise to power of Hitler. It was the coming of the Holocaust and then the Holocaust itself that changed this. There was actually a meeting in Pittsburgh in 1944 where American Jewish groups turned from anti-Zionism or non-Zionism to Zionism. So it's very important when they talk to you, by the way, about anti-Zionism to tell them about that. So you have people who are deeply committed to this within the American body politic, and politicians pay attention to that. They pay attention to two things, mainly money, but also votes. And there's money and votes there. Now, there's a larger number of people, I think, growing number of people today, who don't believe those things, mainly in the Democratic Party. But this is not about party politics. This is about forcing our rulers to do the right thing. Now, this can be done through direct action. This can be done through all kinds of means, but also political means. What they're trying to do in Michigan, say
unaffiliated or
to say unaffiliated in the primary that's
yeah.
I think on Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, this coming Tuesday, is one prong of a fork that has to be put into their backsides. They have to be made to understand that what they're doing is against the overwhelming majority of American public opinion as far as the polls are concerned. We actually represent, the people in this room represent a majority on a number of issues like a ceasefire, like stopping the starvation of Gazans. Most Americans are in favor of that. And these people who rule us and pretend that they represent us are violating the wish of their constituents. They're doing it for the reasons I said: strategy, votes, money.
There's one more question from the audience, which is, the accusation of anti-Semitism is toxic for a lot of people in a lot of places. Universities, certainly you live in the academy, and there's a lot of strange behavior there. But the river, the slogan "From the river to the sea," speak about that and speak about whether that represents anti-Semitism or how people could counter that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that a country which probably a majority of the people who live there consider Palestine should not be free is actually a genocidal idea. To say Palestine must be enslaved, or Palestine must be controlled, or dominated, or ruled, or dispossessed, is actually what you're saying when you say, I oppose the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. As far as I'm concerned, it's Palestine. Now, is there an Israel? Yes. Do Israelis consider an Israel? Yes. Is there an Israeli people? Yes. But does that mean that the Palestinian people have to be subjugated? No. And that's what the slogan stands for. That the people of Palestine, half of whom were ethnically cleansed in 1948, and another 300,000 of whom were ethnically cleansed in 1967, and all of whom who live there live under egregious forms of discrimination, and in most cases, a jackboot military occupation for 56 years, should be free. There should be no qualms about people being allowed to say those words. We were told by our administration at Columbia University that these are discriminatory and anti-Semitic terms. The term intifada, which means uprising against an illegal military occupation. How can that be genocidal? I mean, the occupation itself has proven itself genocidal. Opposing it is genocidal, and then finally, by any means necessary, is supposedly a verboten term. Well, I had an argument with one of the administrators who happens to be African American, and I was saying there's nothing wrong with any of these slogans. And he said, actually, when I was a student, I had by any means necessary and Malcolm X on my dorm. I said, there you are, sir. It didn't change their position.
I'm thinking about, from the river to the sea, because I always thought that it kind of came from like the PLO and like that moment. And one of my friends was like, it's actually a song. That's part of a cultural song, and so it makes me think all these ways in which colonial regimes kind of outlaw indigenous culture, right? So even in something like Algeria, storytelling was outlawed by the French colonial regime, right? Something like Berdache in North America was outlawed by Anglo settlers, and so at the same time, you think like Edward Said, right? Like culture and imperialism, Orientalism is all about how culture is kind of mobilized to further imperialism, but at the same time, right? When you think about Handala, Mansour's Boy in Watermelon, right? All the Rafat, all the kind of literature that's been coming out of Palestine, culture has been so instrumental. And to every social movement, right? Black Panthers in fashion, murals and Chicanos, singing in civil rights movement. But so one of the things I'm kind of been thinking about is how often culture gets co-opted. You think about something like the Black Panthers, that was started out as an anti-police brutality movement that was draped in a pro-black aesthetic. Within a decade, it was spit back out to us as Shaft, who had that pro-black aesthetic but was a police hero figure, right? And so I'm thinking like one of the potentials of this moment is that Palestinian culture isn't co-optable because there's so much of a global resistance to it. And so like I'm thinking like what are kind of like the potentials of culture? I know both of your sons are screenwriters and playwrights as well, and so just thinking about some of if you could speak to that for a little bit.
Yeah, before I answer, that's a great question. Before I answer that, ironically, the from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free happens to rhyme in English. It doesn't rhyme in Arabic. It's never been a slogan. Min al-maya ila al-maya, Palestine Arabiyya happens to rhyme. That's a new slogan, brand new. I heard it from students just the other day. It's maybe a year old. That rhymes. In Arabic, from the river to the sea doesn't rhyme. It's not in PLO literature. You're absolutely right. Yeah. If you look at the PLO charter, you look at the amendments, you look at the decisions of the Palestinian, it's not there. Yeah. It's a much more recent English language slogan. Back to culture. I actually think this is the way to people's heart, the way to people's minds is actually through culture and literature and poetry and drama. And I have seen the impact of this again and again and again and again. People read a book and suddenly they realize, oh my God, or read poetry, and they suddenly realize, oh my God, that speaks to me in a way that boring prose often doesn't. So I can't speak highly enough to it. And there is now, fortunately, beginning to be, in translation into English and into other languages from Arabic, a body of cultural production. Films. I haven't even talked about films. I mean, there's some amazing Palestinian films, dozens and dozens of enormously gifted filmmakers, almost all of whom have stuff out there now. Obviously, Hollywood's not showing it. So, don't count on it appearing in your local, multiplex. But it's there, and you can get it. And there's a bunch of them.
We're going to come to a close, but I want to say one last thing, which is there's a lot to learn in the last hour, and there's still more. I mean, one of the things I love about hanging out with Rashid and Mona, remember when we went and saw the reissue of Lawrence of Arabia, and all through the film, Rashid was muttering, "They didn't go that way; they went that way." And we couldn't watch the film because we were getting a lesson on historical truth. But one of the things I've always loved about Rashid, and one of the things I hope you take from this evening, is not only that there's more to know and that you need to know more. If you're going to be an effective organizer, if you're going to be an effective activist, you need to know more. You need to study more. You need to take study more seriously. But the other thing I hope you saw, because it's very important to me about you, Rashid, is there's a generosity of spirit that somehow is able to be both furious and in a rage, and at the same time wanting to be guided by generosity and love. So let's thank Rashid for being here. So be sure, I want you to be sure to get a book. Rashid will sign it. Get some merch so we can support Palestine Legal. Go over here and look at the QR code. But thank you all for being here. Let's keep building community with each other. Let's keep resisting. Let's keep rising up.
We got the space for a couple more hours, so feel free to hang out, grab some drinks, talk, build. Thank you so much for coming out.